So the time has come to move on to the next session of today's program, and it's named The Cost of Living Crisis Unraveled, where we will talk to or meet Ms. Orsetta Causa, who's a senior economist at the OECD in Paris at the Economics Department, where she is working with, or she's head of actually, the work stream which covers issues around labor market and inequalities. That will later be followed by a presentation of Mr. Jorge Uxo, who has his base in Spain and holds the title Professor of Economics at Universidad Complutense in Madrid, specialized in macroeconomics, economic policy, and in the EMU. So, and I will introduce you later, but we'll start the session by having Mrs. Causa and then Mr. Uxo give us a short introduction, followed then by a panel where Ms. Philippa Siegel-Gluckner will also take part. So please, Ms. Orsetta Causa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My presentation. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I am very honored also and pleased to be here. I think it's going to be a super interesting day, and it already was a super interesting first presentation. So I'm going to give you a very broad overview of issues associated with inequalities generally and the cost of living crisis that we're currently facing. And I will not go into the progressive fiscal policy answers to that, but I would be glad to give some ideas in questions or during the panel. Obviously, this is just a setting the scene presentation. So, one of the patterns that we observed over the last decades has been a decoupling between wages and productivity, which is something we've been working a lot at the OECD, and that was also one of the sources of inequality rising actually from the labor market perspective. And well, this is just a chart that shows you a couple of countries where actually it's interesting to see that at least until the data, when they arrive in this data set, Sweden is not among the countries where you have this divergence, although I think more recent data would give you the same conclusion, but not in the long-term trend. That is already a source of concern, the divergence which is between wages and productivity. So this is the market income inequalities, right? Wages. But then what also was quite striking over the last decades has been a stark decrease in the extent to which taxes and transfers reduce market income inequalities. So in other words, what we call redistribution by fiscal policy, actually. And this is where actually Sweden stands out as being a country that, for sure, remains equal relative to other countries. Inequalities are lower, but there has been a very stark reduction in the progressivity of fiscal policy from the taxes and the transfer perspective. Of course, we can go into that. There is also something that is part of the story about progressive taxes. Is not only taxes, it's transfers. Transfers are important. And there are many countries in the OECD and in Europe where you can see that transfers don't go to the people that need them. In other words, in this chart, you have the share of transfers by the government, social transfers, that go to the bottom and the top quintile. And as you can see, actually Sweden is not part of them, but if you take, for example, my country, Italy, you can see that the blue bar, actually the richest quintile, receive almost half of the transfers and not the bottom quintile. And here we are not, I mean, it's not a question about being pensions, because it's the working age population. So there is really something in the design of and the targeting of transfer that doesn't work. It's not only an issue of how much you spend, but how do you allocate that spending. One of the roots of inequalities, probably the most important one, is about education. And here, also in countries that are wealthy and that redistribute, there is a stark effect of parental background on the outcomes of young people. This is the famous, I think you know, the PISA data by the OECD. We're very proud of this data. very interesting. And here, I just show you for some countries the effect of being in the bottom or the top quarter of the socioeconomic gradient of the family on the outcome of of 15 years old people. So that's, you see there is a stark difference. For example, France, again, it's like from 450 to 550 in the score of PISA. It's actually very bad performer, and the same also, I would say, for Germany. And what is also striking, and this is just an average across countries, but to give you an idea, is that inequalities pile up over time, and they do pile up over time in terms of education, training, skills. And this is the participation in to adult education, okay? The access to training by adult education. And again, stark inequalities. Why? Because the employed get most of the training, and especially the ones that apparently don't need the training because they have level 4 or 5 in the PIAC assessment. This is the adult skills by the OECD, followed by the employed and the inactive. Here also an unfair distribution of access to training, if you want, which we observe here, and that has very important implications. For example, think about today, the need to go digital, green skills, digital skills, etc. If you think about people that need to requalify, for example, in that process. Right now I'm working on green skills, that's why I have this in mind, but those actually, you would need the unemployed to go there. We need the low-skilled people to have training, and that's not the case. The opposite holds. And that's pretty much the case in almost all countries, I have to say. Then, well, this is a very big chart, but just to give you an idea of the fact that we are not yet to a place of gender equality. This is, the employment gap in percentage point and the wage gap in percent between men and women. And as you can see, there is a lot of work to be done here. And, if take Korea, for example, 30% wage gap, but also take Italy, for example, for the employment gap, which is very high, 20 percentage points between men and women. It's huge. And so that's my country, and also I think Sweden is relatively good from that perspective, but also, I want to speak about this cumulative process over the lifetime. What happens if you're a woman, you have low access to the labor market, a bad job, interrupted career, etc., etc. And what happens is the following, is that women face much higher poverty risk than men when they get older, for a number of reasons, but one reason is about their labor market story. Yeah. So you do see that there is a very significant difference in poverty rates at old age between men and women. And actually, you see, Sweden was behaving good in terms of gender gaps, but then you do see also this difference that is quite significant for Sweden of more than 5 percentage points between men and women. Of course, for example, you do see Korea, where it does reflect, obviously, the gender gaps in the beginning. And that's a very important point also for the design of pension system in a lot of countries. Another issue that is related to inequalities is the issue of migration and very difficult integration that sometimes happen for migrant workers. And this is a simple chart where it shows you basically the gap in the unemployment rate between natives and foreign migrants. I guess that's something that we know, and here also there is a problem in Sweden, there is a problem in Italy, in many countries, and of course what is happening in Lampedusa and in Europe, the discussions right now ring a bell to that discussion about the integration of migrants, especially given the labor market vacancies that there are and the shortages that we are observing also, that's in a debate. Another topic which I think is very important, particularly for Sweden, is the problem of housing. So this is quite a complicated chart coming from an old paper of me, but basically what it does show you is that so there has been not only a very important increase in house prices over the latest period, but of dispersion, the dispersion across within countries of house prices, okay? And this is what you see there, for example, in Sweden, also the median and then the dispersion. And what you see here basically is a model that we have estimated, the gravity model, looking at basically the effect of house prices in origin and destination, and basically quantifying the elasticity of migration with internal migration with respect to house prices. And basically what you see is that this negative elasticity for Sweden, for example, means that the increase in a destination in prices reduce the mobility in that place, where is a place where there are opportunities, etc. So there is really some sort of trap effect that contributes to the decline in migration, but also the decline in, the equality of opportunity that brings the fact of moving where opportunities are. And that's actually very, very stark in Sweden. You can see more details. Here, this is a recent paper I've been doing with co-authors at the OECD on the distributional effects of inflation. I have to say that it stops in last year. So it basically looks from 21 to 22 inflation, which was the moment where inflation has been really surging. But it's not super recent. It's not today. But anyway, so that was the pattern. So because the data, the analysis stops in September 22. So basically we just look at the consumer price inflation, and you see here the total inflation, and then you see that during that period, this first year, there was a massive increase in energy and food prices, which was really driving inflation. Now it has become more widespread, but at that moment, that was really the most important thing. And that, of course, when we see that, we say this must have distributional effects, not only inflation, but the fact that it's concentrated on these items. And this is what so there is a research there that I'm not going to explain now because I don't have the time, but you can look at the paper, I can discuss in more detail. We have a modeling effect, we have a model and we have data, and we basically look at the purchasing power loss associated with inflation. And we arrive at this kind of chart, which is basically telling you the total purchasing power loss. For example, in the UK, it's like 12% purchasing power loss. And then we split between the effect of energy, food, and other stuff, which is then detailed in the paper. And you do see that actually there is quite a strong effect, and the strong effect especially from energy in a number of European countries, for example, Germany and UK. But then, of course, one important point here is to say, well, given the basket of consumption of poor people, older people, people living in rural areas, how is this effect distributed across different socioeconomic groups? And here you do have an example about low income versus high income, but in the paper there is more, and I want to point about the effect of where you live, especially people living in rural areas and not in urban areas, you'd observe. And this is the gap between the purchasing power effect of high and low income people. And the total effect is the ball, the green ball. And the green ball is the total effect, and it's decomposed into the effect of energy, food, and other. And you do see that, there is always a regressive effect, which means that poor people are losing more. And this is, except for Mexico, because of the basket of consumption, this is driven by energy. Whereas the other stuff, the non-food, non-energy, which I can come back later, is actually progressive. Why? Because this is hotels, restaurants, taking their airplane, etc., buying a new car, but not the fuel for the car. And we do observe the same pattern, especially, again, as I said, related to the place where you live. Unfortunately, in this paper, we didn't have Sweden because of lack of data. But there is Denmark as a Nordic, and actually in Denmark is quite fairly distributed, at least it was. And here I come back to remember I was telling you about the social transfers. So what did countries do in response to the energy crisis? Well, they spent a huge amount of money to sort of protect the economy, protect consumers, protect households, protect firms. But the problem is that these fiscal costs have not been sufficiently targeted. For example, there has been a lot of price-based support, okay, to reduce prices, but reducing prices is basically reducing prices the same for everybody, whether you're poor, rich, you use your car, you live in the countryside, as opposed to targeted support measure like income support measures that can be targeted. And this is what you see. It's in percentage of the GDP. The fiscal cost, first of all, it's a massive fiscal cost, right? I mean, we're talking about almost 7% of GDP for Greece, for example. And you see that the bulk of this is basically non-targeted. There are various ways we can define that. Here there are details, but whatever you use as a definition, it's really it's almost 1 year, I think, that the OECD continues to say that fiscal support should become more targeted for distributive reasons, for equity reasons, but for fiscal reasons as well, of course, and also for incentive reasons, because obviously, reducing the prices of fossil fuels to combat inflation is going a little bit in the opposite direction of the incentive that we want to bring to green the economy, right? Well, that's all. Thank you.